always like, who's doing these graphics? So, yeah, it's
I
great.
feel like I'm just watching emails come through
You can have the mic ones.
Hey everyone, we're going to get started. So if you can find a seat, that would be lovely.
Maria, it's not working again, the clicky thing. Where did you go? Ah, how do I click on there?
Try now.
Great. Morning, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. Everyone can hear me all right in the back? All right, great. So just want to remind you, this is being recorded. Here's the camera if anybody doesn't want to be on it, choose seats otherwise. So thank you so much for joining us. We are the UMass Amherst Fall Regional Planning Studio. Our project called Valley on Board is a partnership with the Pioneer Valley Transit Authority. And this studio is part of a larger 2-year project that's a partnership between PVTA and the UMass Planning Department. The goal of this partnership is to redesign our regional transit network to better serve current and future riders into the next 20 years. My name is Michelle McHugh, and I, along with my colleagues, Jake Butler, Bo Carpin, and Elizabeth Bragliano, will be walking you through our project to date. So to just quickly take you through our agenda, I will be presenting an overview of the project goals and objectives, along with some general concepts and context. Jake will take a deeper dive into our region today. Bo will go through our SWOT analysis of the existing network and how well it serves the current universe. And Elizabeth will take us through some high-level scenarios and next steps to get us to that final redesign. So just before I introduce our project, which is regional in nature, we'd like to first acknowledge that this region and the University of Massachusetts Amherst were founded and built on the unceded homelands of the Pecumtuck Nation on the land of the Norwottuck community. So to get us started, please let me introduce our client, the Pioneer Valley Transit Authority, represented here today by Tolu Bex-Oke and Alex Forrest. Tolu is with the PVTA and Alex is with the Pioneer Valley Planning Commission. So thank you both for being here. We would also like to welcome the drivers, mechanics, and administrative staff of PVTA that we hope are tuning in virtually, as well as other folks that are here today who we may not have yet met. So a bit of background on PVTA. It was founded in 1974. It is the state's largest regional transit authority. You might hear us refer to that as an RTA throughout our presentation. PVTA has more than 300 buses and vans and 24 participating member communities. It was created by the state as a funding source and to provide oversight and coordination of public transportation within the Pioneer Valley region. The organization's vision is to assist the Pioneer Valley in making our communities more livable through transportation services. And this vision is what our project endeavors to accomplish. So it's important to first understand PVTA's operating parameters. First off, PVTA does not actually operate or maintain buses. It contracts with local providers to deliver these services. And the hubs are indicated here on this map by the pluses. The 24 individual cities and towns help fund PVTA through an assessment that is based on the number of fixed route miles and transit passengers that are served within that city or town. Federal and state funds comprise a significant portion of the budget as well, with farebox revenues and grants making up the rest. So sort of the key takeaway here is that PVTA operates within a complex set of constraints, multiple operators, urban and rural areas, diverse demographics, and a complex funding model. I mentioned that our studio is part of a 2-year project and that our deliverable is the development of a network redesign with a planning horizon of 20 years. To get there, we're working in 4 phases: research, SWOT analysis, which will comprise the bulk of our presentation today, future scenario development, and finally, the route recommendations. So following our project, the next planning studio will take up the task of stakeholder engagement to get public feedback on our draft redesign and make revisions accordingly. Previously, PVTA worked with the consulting firm AECOM to create a comprehensive plan, as all RTAs are required to do. The plan was completed in 2020, and as a 5-year plan, it was somewhat limited in scope and didn't consider some of the specific realities of our region. Another key difference between our project and AECOM's work is that we're really approaching this with an equity lens. I also want to note that our project exists within the context of COVID, which dramatically decreased ridership and also raises red flags about potential long-term transit impacts, as well as climate change, which both poses current and long-term potential threats, as well as a set of unknowns around transit planning. So I've mentioned equity several times already, and there's an important reason for that. Our studio is part of a set of projects funded by a federal HOPE grant, the goal of which is helping obtain prosperity for everyone. HOPE funded PVTA's transit improvement study, and our project came out of that. According to transitcenter.org, which is a foundation that works to improve public transit across the US, public transportation can offer a ladder of opportunity by providing affordable and convenient connections to jobs, to goods and services, to medical care, and to all of the other essentials of daily life. We aim to strengthen this ladder by examining the PVTA network for opportunities to increase not just ridership and efficiency, but also access, particularly for the most vulnerable members of our community. I'll explain in a moment what we mean by access, but I want to first highlight that the Pioneer Valley is home to several communities that fall within the state's definition of an environmental justice community. There's a poster over here that explains what exactly that means, and Jake's going to go into a little more detail on that in a few moments. But suffice to say, these are communities that in which the majority of people, because of various barriers, whether it's low income or language or cultural barriers, don't have the ability to influence decisions that affect their own lives and communities. Because of this vulnerability, and because they are also among the most transit-dependent members of our community, we have deliberately elevated their place in our consideration set. So what do we mean by access? We've got some graphics here from Jarrett Walker's excellent blog on human transit to help briefly explain. So here's a person. We will call her Maria. Maria is in a city full of possible destinations. Maria is a public transit user. By riding public transit, she can get to anywhere in the highlighted area within 45 minutes. So here are all of the destinations within that 45-minute access area. So measuring access by the number of jobs or schools or other things that are in this area helps us start to understand gaps and opportunities in the PVTA network and work to close those gaps to make transit work better for people. One key question for analysis is, how do we expand what people can do? So increasing access is the primary objective of our project, because transit research indicates that when we make access better, we improve all sorts of other measures of transit success. Perhaps most importantly, access improves freedom, which is really one of our most dearly held values in America, right? So in transit planning, there are two basic frameworks related to the objectives of ridership and access: patronage and coverage. Again, we borrowed a couple of graphics from Jarrett Walker. Patronage is about maximizing ridership. It's characterized by fewer routes with more frequency, making the network more efficient to operate. It's the model that you would focus on if you were primarily concerned with return on investment. Coverage, on the other hand, is closely related to access. It means putting more stops in more places to increase the number of destinations that people can reach on public transit. And the trade-off here is that for more geographic coverage, it makes the network slower and more costly to operate. So particularly in an area like the Pioneer Valley that is sparsely populated and highly rural, this is a key consideration. As a result, coverage service is often described as complementary to patronage service. So what we're looking at here is how do we use this to analyze PVTA's network, asking if our only purpose were to maximize ridership, would this exist? The last thing I'll touch on is some of the regional context for our project. PVTA covers a large service area, about 1,200 square miles, which is the size of my home state of Rhode Island. It encompasses 2 counties and a patchwork of urban, suburban, and rural areas. It's anchored by the city of Springfield in the south and the 5 colleges here in the north. The valley has long been a hub of transportation and trade, being at the confluence of 4 major rivers, and also in some of our most fertile ag lands. It's at the crossroads of the Northeast's major economic centers. In fact, it has been sort of branded as the crossroads of New England because it's a major shipping nexus between New York, Boston, Montreal, and the Great Lakes areas. It's also been branded as part of the New England Knowledge Corridor, which stretches into Connecticut and collectively comprises 41 universities and more than 215,000 students. Contrasting this is another set of what we call maybe the more real identities for this region. So it's an agricultural hub. Oops. It's home to a number of environmental justice communities. It has a growing population of Hispanics and an aging population. So as a proportion of our population, more people are over 60 these days. It also has this sort of duality that characterizes the region. You can look at it as kind of urban, rural, north, south, hills and valleys, academic versus institutional. So this dichotomy plays into how we look at the network and who it serves. So lastly, our team examined the regional planning context for this project, of course, including both current and planned land use, economic development plans and trends, and the overall makeup of who lives and works in the Pioneer Valley today. So with that, I will hand it over to Jake, who will take us on a deeper dive through our region today.
Thank you. Yeah, sorry for the technology stuff. Fabulous. So thank you, Michelle, for that wonderful introduction. Take this off. So now I'm going to continue with providing a little more in-depth overview for our region itself. And I'll first explain how we got to know this region and the PVTA system. And then I'll talk about what types of people make up this valley. And then I'll talk about how PVTA fits into that landscape. So we started off getting to know the PVTA system by first visiting 2 of the garages in the system that serve as operations hubs. One of them is in Springfield, and the other one is right here in Amherst, right on campus. And so from here, we were able to have discussions with those on the front lines of management and daily operations of PVTA. And they identified their main concerns currently for us, one of which is the driver shortage due to the pandemic. And this is a really common theme across many industries today, to have that worker shortage. And so this is a picture of us at the UMass Transit Garage, and it is located on the northwest corner of campus, not very far from the engineering buildings. So though many of us live here and use transit on a regular basis, it was essential for us to get out and ride the routes ourselves. And so by riding routes in different geographical contexts throughout this region, we were able to study how truly diverse it is. And so, for example, we covered urban, suburban, and rural settings. And as you can see here in this map, a lot of ground was covered from east to west and north to south. And we were able to understand what it really is like to rely on transit firsthand. So once we gained the understanding of our regional diversity and transit firsthand, then we went ahead and dug deeper back, into the studio, right? So from reviewing transit trends, from regional planning documents and other literature necessary, we were able to apply these concepts to our system and our region. And we engage with digital tools for analyzing and interpreting data, utilizing a cloud-based transit planning software called Remix. And this program allowed us to overlay transit data with census data, visualizing different spatial factors. Remix will also be the platform we use to engage in our network redesign later in the semester when we get to that stage of the project. And this background image here is a great example of what the Remix user interface looks like. So now we've done our research, and now we're moving along to the discussion of the Pioneer Valley itself. So a large overarching theme to keep in mind here throughout the discussion is that this region presents a very clear north-south divide, not just in terms of physical geography, but demographically as well. So the northern portion, which is Hampshire County, is much more heavily influenced by the large student population from the 5 colleges. And they predominantly use the Amherst system of PBTA, and that's mainly fare free. But while the southern section, on the other hand, which is Hampton County in this case, is much more urbanized and sprawl-like development pattern, and it's a lot more culturally diverse, especially in the cities of Holyoke and Springfield. So who needs transit? We all do. Transit is the backbone of our transportation system here in the Pioneer Valley. There's no doubt about that. But through this HOPE grant that we're working with here, we are aiming to further develop a system that really focuses on equity and accessibility, given the goals of these grant projects are to improve transit in, quote, areas of persistent poverty. That's from the FTA. And so this really for us is environmental justice communities. And these communities mainly suffer from poverty. They have a lot of language barriers, and often they contain a majority of people of color. And so, however, there are other groups in this valley that we also must keep in mind when going forward with our network redesign. And these include people who are living in rural areas, folks who are a little more elderly, and persons with disabilities. So as an example of measuring environmental justice communities in our region, this chart here shows how they are more burdened with housing costs. So housing and transportation do not exist in isolation. And as regional planners, we have to think of them as directly related. So being located in an environmental justice community and being in an additional population for concern, like I just mentioned before, they're not mutually exclusive, right? So for example, those who do not have access to a vehicle, those who have a disability, and those who use a bus as their main commuting method are certainly more likely to live in an environmental justice community than not. And this is important to understand because these populations overlap, and it helps us determine where to be focusing most in our network redesign going forward. So let's talk about now how PBTA fits into this region itself. So these graphics here show what people have the freedom to access by transit. And this is measured in a radius of 1/4 mile from a bus stop. So the chart on the left-hand side shows the population of destinations such as schools, such as SNAP retailers, and medical care facilities in the Pioneer Valley that are within that buffer zone of 1/4 mile from a PBTA bus stop. The map reveals where they are located, and they are certainly concentrated more in the urban areas, and there's great connection throughout the system. So as Michelle discussed previously, you can label pieces of a transit system with a patronage and coverage model. Patronage being more geared towards moving people as fast as possible, and coverage being more about covering area itself. So a coverage route would not really exist if routes were not really serving rural areas, right? There's a lot of coverage routes here in this valley that serve mainly rural areas. So another concept we applied to this system are route classifications, as cited from the Florida Department of Transportation. And so these top three to understand are circulator routes. And these are concentrated in urban areas usually that form sort of a loop shape. A great example right here on campus are the 34 and 35 bus routes, if you're familiar with those. Another one to consider is a radial route, which usually starts in an urban area and extends out into the outskirts of that urban area. And a regional route, the last one to really keep in mind here, is one that really kind of traverses a region and goes from one urban area to another. And the B43 is a great example of that. And so, I'm so sorry. Putting our system into these kind of categories, it really helps us understand how geography shapes how people get from place to place. And this will help us a lot, again, in going forward with our network redesign. So we really want to emphasize here that PVTA is not alone. FIRD has a role to connect with other transportation systems, looking at the larger picture here, right? So this map shows other transit lines and their connections from PVTA to other cities, like Albany, New York, Hartford, Connecticut, and then Worcester and Boston further east. So this is definitely a piece of that accessibility puzzle that we were discussing, and that longer distance of travel, we want to think simply beyond the commute time, right? We want to think bigger than that because we're regional planners. And so now that I've discussed the PVTA and our region, I'm going to turn it over to Bo to discuss our SWOT analysis. All right, guys.
Okay, can you hear me? All right, I'm sort of soft spoken, so I'll try to speak up. Right, on to the SWOT analysis. So what is a SWOT analysis? It's a tool for understanding the relationships between strengths and weaknesses of the system, and that tend to be internal to a system, and opportunities and threats that might be more external factors. And so this has been a big cumulative and culminating exercise for us this semester, pooling all of our observations through our various sources of analysis and organizing them into these four overarching categories, then through much discussion, whittling it down, making connections, and seeing where observations might relate to system-wide trends. So the full SWOT analysis is quite extensive, but today we'll walk through some of the high-level points of view. So starting with the strength, you saw this map just before with the existing condition section. We see that overall, we feel that people and critical destinations are well connected within the urban core of the system. We see that 44% of the population and 81% of critical destinations are located within a walkable quarter-mile distance for at least one of the stops. And we see that this well-connected urban core is also aligned with the majority of the environmental justice communities in our area, suggesting that the current system provides service to the transit ridership well. However, we need to sort of nuance this first understanding of access in terms of what can you get to, with considerations around how issues of universal accessibility and age affect walkability and access, how the quality of access is defined equally by frequency and transit time, and how this idea of a well-connected urban core might also speak to a weaker connectivity of the more rural half of the population. So in that rural half of the population, we see that high mileage, low ridership routes, what we are calling coverage routes in transit language, characteristically have some inefficiencies. And for this sort of research, we've been looking at the Ware-Palmer route that you see just over here as a case study for that. This is actually a map of the routes ranked by low ridership. So that's why that's bold there. I'm highlighting these coverage routes essentially. So this is a flex route, and characteristically it runs on a lower frequency. It has a smaller shuttle bus size, and it allows users to sort of self-adapt the system to their first, last, and health needs. So they can call in, pick up locations anywhere within 3/4 of a mile of the fixed route. And we see opportunities for replication of this model throughout the network. Really the goal here is to better match capacity with demand while still providing that quality service to these outlying populations. We might include a lot more elderly population aging in place that might not fall into the typical environmental justice communities that we're sort of using as this proxy for transit and ridership in our area. Now zooming into a more micro level of connectivity, we looked at the Valley Bike Share system as one option for micro mobility. This is a new and growing bike share program that has many stations located within our urban hubs in the area. Often these stations are located at critical destinations themselves, so things like medical centers, entertainment venues, and they're often located in our environmental justice communities, which are in our urban hubs, and often nearby some of the big transfer nodes within the PTA system. So we're seeing that this suggests the bike share system is well connected to the PTA network and offers an opportunity for its riders to address their first last mile needs as they get to the final destination. However, the current data shows that the majority of this service is being used by those in university towns in the northern half of the service area. So as a new service, we need to do a little more data collection to address the potential impact and reach it can have on the work transit and ridership. Now, zooming back out to a more macro view of connectivity, we feel that the PTA's recent planning efforts around efficiency improvements is a strength of the system itself. So we looked at express routes. We also looked at some planning efforts around exploring transit priority treatments and best rapid transit systems. So first, with the express routes, we looked primarily at ridership metrics to start with. So we saw that these express routes, when they're brought online as new versions of popular existing routes, they're taken on very quickly by ridership. So for example, the P21E saw a 12% increase in ridership after its first year. We also noticed that many of or all of the current express routes in the network either saw steady or increased ridership through the pandemic. So that was especially of note to us as well. And then we also took some qualitative observations via route guides on 2 of the new express routes, the B43E and the G73E, that were implemented recommendations of last year's comprehensive plan update. We also looked at some of the planning efforts around bus rapid transit systems. For those of you who are unfamiliar with this, I like to think of it as sort of train-like buses. So they have designated running lanes, and they have off-bus ticketing mechanisms, similar to if you're going on the subway or if you're from DC, the metro. And there's sort of a divide with transit priority treatments. There are a whole host of other infrastructure upgrades, things like Queen jump lanes or Q jump lanes. Sorry, I'm not always get that one wrong. Where there's a separate short lane that allows buses to navigate in front of a traffic signal and circumvent traffic. Similarly, shoulder running buses go on the shoulder of a highway to navigate traffic. So there are some studies looking at applying these sort of treatments to some of the highest ridership routes in the north and south of the region. Overall, we feel that it's a strength to potentially expand these sort of efficiency treatments. We see that it not only affects efficiency, but it affects access in terms of reducing that travel time for riders. And by reducing travel time, it reduces operating costs, it captures more riders by creating that better service. It has the ability to capture more commuter ridership that can drive more fare-driven funding for the whole system. And in general, we're seeing these efficiency methods as sort of an overlay tool to address some of the inherent weaknesses of the current hub and spoke system configuration itself. But we listed this as a threat because transit priority treatments, BRT, these type of things involve infrastructure builds. So they need to go through individual town planning processes, approval processes, whereas express routes that might be more low-hanging fruit per se are still threatened by traffic congestion that could render them Another tricky strength threat in the system is the need for integrating land use and transit planning. So it's important for the PUTA to engage in intermediate and long-term planning to understand how land use changes affect the destinations it's trying to connect its riders to, i.e. why we're here today. And so we see an opportunity that many of the municipalities in the valley are engaging and prioritizing in infill and transit-oriented development. And we feel that the PUTA can use this knowledge to leverage its existing assets to better support that smart growth and to sort of repair some of its current system weaknesses. So for example, we observed that there is some commercial vacancy in some of the end lines of the fixed routes, and this relates to this sort of nationwide trend we're in with the death of the shopping mall. We also noticed that there's a lack of park and rides throughout the system. So for those of you who aren't familiar, park and rides are a transit infrastructure, allow drivers to park their vehicle, board transit, board public transit. It's a way to connect the more suburban areas with city cores to alleviate traffic congestion. So in the system currently, there's only 4 park and rides, and they are mostly located in the northern half of the service area. We see that there might be an opportunity for adaptive reuse and address some of these weaknesses. But again, it is a threat because that would require this sort of infrastructure redevelopment, would require going through individual municipal planning process and potentially navigating some lengthy zoning processes as well. So I want to go back to this last time and say that while our project is prioritizing transit riders' needs, we're also asking the broad question, how can the system work better for everyone? How can it work better as a whole? How can it be more self-sustaining so that we can then make particular investments in specific areas? So one of these specific investments might be addressing some transit or emission-related negative health outcomes that have persistently and disproportionately affected low-income and minority neighborhoods. So Springfield has had a bad history of poor air quality and high asthma rates. And when we look at these areas, these urban areas in relationship to the PUTA network, we see that those are areas in the EJ communities where there's high ridership routes, and these local routes also have a high number of stops. So we see that there's an opportunity as the PUTA is continuing to expand its electric fleet, which it brought 4 electric buses on last year, and I believe they're scheduled to bring on 10 to 12 more electric buses next year. But there's an opportunity to find these high ridership routes with many stops that could allow electric vehicles to recharge as they stop. So it's more efficient in that way. And there's also an opportunity there to lower diesel fumes and emissions in those areas of the highest population density. So you see that this could be a strength of the system moving forward. It could also be a threat as more traffic congestion sort of exacerbates those negative health outcomes for those urban populations. And then a final equity-based observation, we see that the lack of bus stops amenities is a weakness of the current system. So there's sort of this divide in terms of 66% of stops have no bus shelters. And those are primarily located in the more northern half of the service range, where there is more tree canopy, versus 61% of stops that do not have adequate tree shade, and those are located in the southern EJ communities. So this was, part of this data comes out of observations from the comprehensive plan update of 2020, and they also recognize the need for more standardized processes for locating, studying, and maintaining these shelters, especially because, again, this is a threat external to the system that for these sort of infrastructure upgrades, PUTA cannot do it alone. They have to work with the municipalities in their jurisdictions. But it stands, the question still remains, are these bus stop amenities adequate for rider comfort and rider dignity, especially considering threats from climate change in our area, like rain events and increased heat waves? So these are some of the big trends that we've been looking at, some of these connections, some of these overlapping areas, and we'll be moving forward to use these observations of our SWOT analysis to think about how to group external forces into scenarios, and then to look and identify which strengths and weaknesses can support alternatives that will allow the PUTA to navigate those scenarios and still meet their goals around equity, access, and efficiency. And with that, I will pass it off to Elizabeth.
Okay, thank you, Bo. So I just want to take a moment right now to step back and to revisit the big picture. So we have PVTA received the HOPE grant funding from the Federal Transit Administration, which they use then to fund the Pioneer Valley Transit Review and Improvement Planning Study, or PV TRIPS. PVTA is working with 4 key partners who are shown here on the slide. Each is responsible for a different and unique aspect of the scope of work. The UMass Amherst Landscape Architecture and Regional Planning Department scope of work has been titled Valley on Board. It will be completed across a 2-year time span, and it will be executed by the regional planning studios in the fall semesters. This fall of 2021, our studio will culminate with the recommendation of a network design modification. Our work completed will be turned over to the 2022 fall studio, who will then be responsible for implementing and carrying out developing a stakeholder engagement program. The fall 2022 studio students will also then incorporate the feedback they receive from the stakeholder engagement program and make final network design recommendations. Our work moving forward will be centered on scenario analysis for this year's studio. Because we never really know what the future is going to hold or what it looks like, it is our job as planners to consider all of the alternatives and all of the possible futures that may exist. Developing scenarios allows us to consider the wide array of possibilities, and doing so makes our resulting plans more informed, more efficient, more effective, and more likely to be implemented. In our analysis thus far, we have identified several trends which illustrate how land use concerns, changing demographics, and economic development will contribute to our scenario planning. For example, I just want to highlight some of the major disruptions and paradigm shifts that we have found to be some trends. First and foremost, the COVID-19 pandemic. The immediate impact of the pandemic was a drastic decrease in ridership. According to the American Public Transportation Association, transit ridership in 2020 dropped by 79% compared to pre-pandemic levels in 2019. And although riders have started to return to public transit, that level of ridership is still below the pre-pandemic levels. We also need to consider some of the more long-term shifts that have resulted from the pandemic. For example, the increase in remote work and remote schooling. And we need to think about what this may do and how this may impact the scenarios we develop. We also need to consider labor shortages. As mentioned earlier, nationwide, the public transportation industry is facing a growing workforce shortage. The trend can cause some major service disruptions and is due in great part to shifting demographics. The experienced workforce is reaching a retirement age, and we're noting trends in the younger workforce, the younger generations, and what they value as workers. Finally, we also want to highlight climate change and what the impacts of climate migration may be on the region and on the scenarios that we develop. In addition to the trends that we've noted here, we also plan to conduct interviews with local planning and economic development offices. The results of these conversations and the trends that are noted through these offices will also be included in our scenario development. Presented here, we have some typical Pioneer Valley scenarios that are characterized by a push and pull, increase and decrease among the local industry and the educational services industry. These scenarios have focused mainly on economic drivers, and they are representative of how planners have traditionally thought about scenarios in this region. Since we noted so many different trends that come into play and really need to be considered when we develop scenarios, our studio would like to take a more comprehensive approach to our scenario building to ensure that we are getting the fullest picture in the face of uncertainty of any possible future that there may be for this region. Finally, we will use these scenario analyses to guide our building of a route design recommendation. Starting with the PVTA's existing system map, we will apply the metrics of ridership, of efficiency, accessibility, and equity to generate a route design alternative that responds to the scenarios that we develop. We will hand these alternatives off to the fall 2022 studio class for their further refinement through the public engagement process. So in conclusion, public transportation is not just about moving people. It's about connecting people with destinations. It's about providing access, whether that access be to employment, education, or basic life necessities. Public transportation is about expanding options. It is about freedom. We urge you to please check out our website at www.valleyonboard.org for some additional information. We'll have a recording of this presentation, as well as additional graphics, maps, and photos that will continue to be updated there. We urge you also to please use that website to contact us and communicate with us with any questions, comments, or feedback that you might have. At this point, I'd like to thank you for your attention to our presentation. Extend a special thank you to Ms. Tolu Bex-Oki, to Mr. Alex Forrest, and of course to our UMass Amherst Garage and the Satco Garage staffs for hosting us at their locations, and to Dr. Camille Barchers for her patience, guidance, and mentorship through this studio journey. Okay, at this point, I'd like to open the floor to your questions. We'll direct the questions to our studio class who are sitting here in the front section. And I do ask that you just raise your hand so I can come to you with the microphone. Well, I would like our clients to ask the first question, so I don't know if you're all
Good morning, everyone. My name is Sandra Schmidt. I'm the Transit Authority. This is Paul Burns, who is the Director of Transit Operations, and I know that some from Mass Transit, Adam here, some from Mass Transit as well, and obviously Tulu is here, and Alex from TUC. Thank you so much for taking on this project. We're really excited about the product that you're going to develop for us. I am very pleased with what I saw today. The presentation was wonderful. Thank you, Michelle, Elizabeth, Michelle, Bolo, and Jake. Thank you so much. It was really, really good. I learned a lot of things. I am very interested to see what the final result is because of the scenario planning that you're utilizing. That is very in line with PVTA's mission. We see transportation as a matter of opportunity. We see transportation as quality of people that we serve. If they don't have transportation, they can't do a lot of things like you mentioned. So some of the GIS information that you have, obviously we have some of that data, but it's nice to see that we are affirmed by a group of students that have taken a look at our system. And I'd like to find out how we are going to make it better. Looking forward to that. As you mentioned, we're on study on certain information. I think it was a report that was rushed, nothing to do with the consultants, but I think extending the time to do a report or an analysis is really good. I have two questions, actually 3 questions. I wanted to know why we are using only a quarter of a mile on either side of the street. So a quarter of a mile, why are we using a quarter of a mile? There was a particular reason why the quarter of a mile was selected, and also the route classification, any particular reason why we're doing the Florida Department of Transportation definition of the route classification. And just for curiosity's sake, when we do any of our analysis, when we were planning activities, we're always looking at quarters of a mile because that's the distance that someone's willing to walk. But if that's reduced because it makes more sense. In some of our areas in Springfield, we know that there are some barriers that might not be winter, the sidewalk might be clear, there might not be enough lighting, and in some of the rural communities, there's no sidewalks. So are you willing to take that step and walk in the middle of the road with everybody else? I just was curious to see why you're selecting that and why also the Florida transportation definitions. Out of curiosity. One of those questions that
Yeah. So thank you for your questions and thank you for coming today. One thing I want to bring up, the quarter of a mile, definitely been critical of. We use it as sort of base level default, but understand that a lot of the literature that's coming out today in regards to planning has realized that that is sort of an arbitrary number that is used, but not really definition. But in our more in-depth planning, we've seen it a half mile, maybe more of a reality. And in our footprint, we absolutely plan to expand that for as a base map. We initially have involved in this parameter. You'll see actually on a few of the maps that are present. Question. We did expand out and understand that it's a
there's no sidewalk. We do have the 4 seasons, but our winters are really long. If you think about it, it's already started to get cold. It's going to get dark early, and you don't want to walk on a road just along the car. So if you could just keep that in mind when you're looking at a rural community, the distance should be shorter depending on what amenities are available. And then for the more urbanized area where you have lighting, pedestrian lighting, and crosswalks and things like that, the half a mile or 3/4 of a mile will be fine. It's just, I think personally, I'm not sure what
I think Senator's point is really important because you all are looking at things like bus shelters and sidewalk and the supporting infrastructure that makes things accessible. So in a lot of your work, you've already started to determine that in some places a quarter mile is great, and in other places, maybe people are willing to walk further, but it takes a really fine-grained sort of land use built environment analysis. And so I think this point about what works in our urban areas doesn't work in our rural areas is really, really critical to thinking about the route design.
In terms of trip purposes, one other qualifier that we make a very big difference in terms of, especially if you're looking at a single mile or a family that's looking at daycare and access to daycare that's using the bus route to get there. That 3/4 mile trip is going to be a huge getting to the bus stop, then getting to daycare. So I think that also needs to be part of the consideration. There are certain areas and riders who even a quarter mile might be accessible. Given the situation. So I know we can't address everything, but it's certainly important.
And I would add to that too, thinking about grocery stores as one of those particular destinations that a quarter mile does not necessarily work for all. Henry, did you want to speak to classifications?
I think the Florida DOT classification is a standard classification system in the industry, although it is from 2009, so it could be a little dated, but I think it's useful for the redesign.
I just wanted to know, I think they could-
Yeah, I actually think that the classification directly relates to that quarter mile or sort of buffer zone. Because if you identify the more coverage routes that are mainly rural, maybe that serve more rural communities, that could be an indicator of that shorter buffer zone that we're talking about with the lack of infrastructure that people can't use really to get home safely, from their bus stop. I think that's really important.
I also ask for when you're looking at the amenities and all climate and the same matters. We will love to put shelters everywhere, and obviously there's the threat that you mentioned, where it's on the boat. You have to get permission from the communities if there's no concrete pad and concrete pad and all that. But it would be nice to have, like, depending on the size of the ridership, what type of amenities we should have. And if it's a rural community and we can't really put anything on 116 because it's a state highway, you need an ordinance and whatever they call those requirements from the state. That may be solar lighting, like minimal, this is the minimum requirement for this section and this is ideally for this area. So that we could have like a map and then use that as part of our in order for us to get funding for certain projects, we have to have it in a program that's called Transit Asset Management Plan. And so we list all of our bus stops and then at the side for each one, we'll say this is what's needed at each of them. And so that's considered part of our plan. If we have that from you guys, put it into our existing plan, then we could request funding for it and then move forward with whatever is recommended. But I think it should be staged. You're not going to do in I don't know, say, well, we can't put a golf shelter when you're only picking up 2 passengers, but in Springfield, they're picking up 20 passengers, yes, you need it larger. Like, if you had a little tiny one, I hate it small, that just really won't work when you have over 40 students standing there waiting for us. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I think we're hoping to build off some of the analysis that was conducted in the comprehensive plan update where they did map areas that didn't have shelters with the ridership or the boarding rates for those bus stops. So trying to build off of that as well as some of the information that you have well collected via the Southern Region Customer Survey analysis that was identifying the long wait times at certain bus stops, where that might be more of an understanding like where to prioritize adding those services along with what you're saying about what types of amenities are appropriate for those areas. Great feedback for us.
There's those poles that you put the thing down and you sit and have a light. You can do that anywhere as opposed to put in a big shelter. So there's different things. But it will be nice to see what you guys come up with.
I think I'm good so far. I really
This is not so much a question, but just kind of a follow-up on the issue of access radii around subs. When you're dealing with just a circular radius around the stop without reference to the surrounding sidewalks or street network, then I think probably a quarter mile is more fair, just because the actual walking distance will usually be longer than the radius that you're using. On the other hand, if you have enough data to do, a network-based along the sidewalk network access to bus stops, get away with slightly longer distances because you can actually think that this is how far people are walking and not just all parking within certain radius. So that's all for now.
I don't have any questions. I don't have any questions really, but I will share that I think we're in a wonderful moment in America. we may actually get funding for more infrastructure. But we need more bodies, we need more drivers. That is the major stumbling block for the entire transportation industry right now, is having enough CDL licensed drivers. We've been struggling with that for 30 years. This is the worst we've ever experienced. And that was partly the pandemic, but it's more so, for us, it's never been about the aging of the driving workforce. For us, we've always had 18 to 25-year-olds driving for us. But the entire transportation industry is struggling to find people who are willing to drive buses. And that's a real challenge that needs to be addressed. Through funding, maybe paying drivers more. I don't have the answers for all of that. I can just share with you that you can buy all the buses and infrastructure you want, but if you have no bodies to make that stuff work, where are you? You've got it stored for the next generation until you find the bodies to make it all. That's my.
I think we need to pick Mike. When I don't know if that was set up for him, but it worked.
While Henry gets his questions addressed, I'll just share this as well, that, there is talk of autonomous vehicles coming. Honestly, in reality, we don't see very large vehicles autonomously driving through this. Have you ever driven through class change or walked through class change? Well, let's think about a driverless vehicle going through that class change process. It would be very difficult and challenging. There is certain amount of humanity that needs to come into play when you have to aggressively but assertively insert your way back into traffic. And so if you have an autonomous vehicle making that decision and it's based on, I need the proper amount of clearance, that bus is never going to move. So, there's it's coming. Maybe 20 years from now, and there'll be a way to run large commercial vehicles autonomously in this sort of an environment. But we have 20 years of needing drivers, so we can think about that.
When I was wondering, stand in front of the little kind of stop and shop just to see which way it goes. But I do. Is he ready? Henry, are you ready? Almost. Because one of the questions that I wanted to ask, ready? Okay.
I would say that the research from the MBDA shows that if you add transit priority treatments, it speeds up service and lessens the need for drivers.
I will say too, one of the things, which was really striking here from project struggle with so it was very alarming to hear about the issues concerning drive, something that sort of popped in my head, sort of normalizing, introducing the trades, introducing collaboration between technical schools, and getting the young kids who college might not be the best fit for them. And you're talking about union jobs, pay grade, great benefits, great quality of life. And I think that there's absolutely room considering how we can expand from the policy standpoint, how we can expand public-private partnerships or tech schools into serving as peers. CDL licenses, I call this something close. I'm with you on the autonomous vehicles. I don't think we're here. I don't think we're ever do it personally, given the safety concerns. But until that, we have to absolutely we can build out all we want. But some of the stuff I think that we should explore in the class and project is where there's room for policy recommendations. Start to link up you guys with like tech schools. We have Springfield, who has not it's not nearly something like 20% of the population of this area is in school, 5 or 6% down people, when we talk about bridging the gap, help people move from one level of poverty to the next. That is a pathway that I think should be. And you move from $12, $15 an hour to 26, 27 with lifetime, protection. So
How about paying high school graduates to train for a CDL license instead of charging them to go to New England Tractor Trailer School? And, they have to come out of pocket with $1,500 or $2,000 to go get their CDL license. That's not inviting people into the CDL industry. How about we get government grants to pay people to go to get?
yeah, and another thing that we're considering is like fleet management. Considering in fleet management, you can shift someone off the CDL, get them into those positions where you guys can take the time. If I remember correctly, somewhere between 4 and 6 months to finish up the CDL training. And so,
6 weeks.
okay, well, that's even quicker than I initially assumed. So, it's like you get people in, looking at fleet management, certainly on our radar.
The use of different size vehicles also alleviate some of the required CDL. We are changing the way we try to attract people now. So we're not paying for people to CDL. So the new program starts next week or so requires us to pay for the CDL. Just like we do here. So before you needed to come into the CDL without paying fees. But now somebody might have to do, we have to find ourselves in a different way. I just want to ask you a question. When you're looking at the threads, you have the students, do you have statistics or any information that shows that the number of students is increasing across the board? Because I had spoken with the one of the staff at Collegiate College, and their enrollment is down. The enrollment that is up is all the other institutions, the public institutions, enrollment is down. So I was wondering if that's a trend. I know in the school system where children go to school, and there's less kids behind the children. So I don't know if it's just less people coming out and how that's going to affect the workforce for all of us.
Yeah, I'm looking at Henry, it's like he knows these numbers better than I. But that is a trend, and it is something that we need to explore. And UMass Amherst is the one that's sort of the exception to what's happening now. If we could open it up to some faculty comments or questions, that would be great.
I like the presentation. It's very well produced content. This my comment relates to something that's come up on this, and that is the history and the larger story of Western Massachusetts development pattern, people who live here, how that all plays into their scenarios. We don't know the future, that's true, but we know the past. So, when I hear that Springfield has one of the strengths of the well-connected urban core, it doesn't ring true to me. So, the history of segregation and land patterns in the valley, they conspire against public transportation laws. This is history of transportation, public transportation in the United States. So we're all focused on the pandemic, but I really don't know what long-term trends have been historically Western Mass public transportation. So are we part of whatever's happening now? I just don't know. Are we what's happening now? Is this part of the long-term decline or stable system? So what's the context of what is being done? And that I think would probably want some of your scenarios. And then I know that, well, then I just didn't know what you were looking at, or if you could get data from the general public. The transit system has done lots of information. Would you be able to use that information, the data that's already been collected?
that is just kind of like a high level, because we haven't delved into the scenario planning portion of this too deeply yet. We just started to kind of flirt with that area. And what that has looked like so far is we've done some reading of comprehensive plans from each of the sort of regional, PC, so many acronyms. As well as individual cities and towns. We've also looked at economic development plans for City of Springfield, for some specific neighborhoods in Springfield. We have looked at Henry's kind of predictive model showing trends in population and where we're likely to end up in 2040. So these are some of the kind of initial pieces of data that we're starting to pull together so that we can get that bigger picture. I mean, we're also looking at national trends and overall regional New England trends in terms of like who's coming here, where are they coming from, what are their needs, so that's why when we were talking about data pointing to that our proportion of our population is going to be older, more heavily Hispanic, more Spanish speaking. These are some of the things that are starting to emerge from that initial data analysis.
I think too, Michael's comment about transportation usually being the sort of dividing, fracturing force in urban cores in the US. I mean, that's something we absolutely have to consider. So we present downtown Springfield as well connected by PTA, maybe in comparison to the northern area, it appears that way with our mapping and analysis, but when you're actually at a bus stop and you're trying to go to the grocery store, that's definitely not the case. So I think that's one thing. And then the other thing is Alex and who shared with us all of their rider surveys. We have a huge amount of data, but I think, and Alex, correct me if I'm wrong, PDTA is a little bit of an outlier in that the ridership decreases that we suffered from the pandemic, we've been able to return maybe more quickly to some ridership levels than other arts in some locations.
For the national average, our initial losses weren't as steep either.
Right.
Although it depends a lot on the part of the system we're talking about.
Yeah, and overall, many of the other agencies who rail and commuter rail, subway, which were more effective, but overall bus transit did have the least. And that is in accordance with what we observed.
It's definitely necessary for us to continue looking at the different halves of the service area. It's quite extensive, and so as we got into the research, we kept noticing, okay, we can't see very fine grain if we're looking at the whole system. So in the final report, and as we move into these next steps, we will keep zooming into certain areas and getting into more of that finer grain and understand that nuance better. So all of these are very helpful for us to direct our attention.
Thank you. There are a couple of things in terms of scenario development that I'd like to maybe think about. One is using transportation as a lead indicator rather than lag, that in effect it would influence the example. I was responsible for creating the UMass Springfield team. And one of the things that happened was we put it all together. And the first thing up was the union contract for all of our faculty says that you will not build a UMass activity parameters further than 10 miles. So automatically what we have is an indicator that says, in fact, this should work, and transportation is in place to support this. But the fact is that there is an issue there. The second is when we wanted to start attracting people from Holyoke and Springfield up to UMass evening colleges, and that we found that the bus system at that time, with no direct access from Holyoke or Springfield to Amherst, that would enable the students to come and take the classes from 6 to 9 and then get the bus back. I know these are detailed, but what they are in terms of environmental justice are the things that we need to look at. We have to look at the fact that the farming community is changing dramatically here.
We're getting out of tobacco, hand over fist, moving into potatoes. You think about that in terms of, bits and pieces of your small buses in your service areas, there are indicators like that. Finally, we've been involved, Henry and I were involved with the East-West Rail Line and the coming of a potential stop in Palmer. And what we found in our work is one of the areas of great interest was the UMass students getting to Palmer on buses or cars, and then zipping into Boston. And the thing is right now, in part of this East-West Rail Line, is whether or not Palmer will be served. And so what we translates, will UMass be served? And so these indicators and these lead possibilities and the lag, I think, have to be addressed very, very carefully. And I think in the knowledge for all of you, your point about going into the words in the master plans is absolutely right. You got to dig deep, because these incremental changes are all going to come together, and I think we're going to have a dramatically different valley.
Thanks. You guys did a great job. So professional. So proud of you. I guess my question is one's a question and there's just comments. It seems like one of the groups left out of your groups, you had the elderly, but you didn't have youth. Youth can't drive yet. So when you see who's riding the bus in Amherst, even you see a lot of school age kids riding the bus after school, getting home, staying in town, after sports activities. So I think you want to think about for all your communities, how are school kids using the buses beyond the school bus system, because it allows them a mobility that they don't have on the bus, and freedom they don't have. So think of the youth, and you look at demographics across communities where more youth. What are the things they want to do? Where can they get to? And they can get jobs. How can they get to those jobs? So that links into employment centers where I think that's somewhere. But we're the major employment centers in the valley, and how to get to those jobs. And the last thing is I just think like school bus drivers today also drive PVTA buses, or could they? Or what's that link? There's a school bus driver shortage. Schools are back in sessions. What's the relationship in the workforce with school bus drivers? That's my question. I think you guys do a great job. Yes, it's scenarios.
Yeah, great job. And I want to start out by saying you can't do everything. As it were trying. But I will say, and I appreciated the idea of climate change, but I didn't see it fundamentally addressed. Buses can be a part of the emergency evacuation process if they can go in that way. So I think about that as part of the public safety infrastructure, particularly for people who don't have cars, is going to be really helpful as we go forward into more intense storms, floods, etc. And also, for me, raises questions of how secure are the facilities in terms of responding to changes in climate. The facilities probably go into relatively low property value areas, which may very well be on wetlands, etc. So I want to think about those issues a little bit. If there are ways to make the buses easier to handle during floods or questions like that would be really interesting. If you have.
I think Elizabeth's point is an excellent one. And if you remember back to when we were with Glenn and Nicole and Jesus and all of our mechanics, the bus lifetime in a winter climate is pretty reduced. I'm looking at Glenn for confirmation, but there's a lot to consider too with what we heard from the drivers in the garages about so I think it's a good one.
Just a quick question for a client, I guess, that is, if we're going to explore the idea of potentially buses being deployed in emergency service, is there a mechanism in place that allows for that to happen? Like, is there an approval process that has to go through? Can that be triggered quickly?
We are part of the anytime that a community has an emergency, like if there's a fire, a couple of fires last year in the city of Holyoke, and they had to move everybody from the housing to whatever temporary housing, we sent the buses. We get someone from, even a mechanic to go drive that bus. And we went to the facility to evacuation for the elderly at senior centers. So we are part of the Western Mass Emergency Management. Our buses are, I mean, we will probably, if it's a huge emergency event, you know, the governor declares an emergency, we'll probably stop service and then transport whatever needs to be done. Yeah.
I slept in a bus in Sunderland in 2 winters ago during a power outage along the Old
Oh,
Town
yes, that's
Road.
right.
In case anyone needed a warming space, so we do that. We have good relationships with every police jurisdiction within our service area.
And we've done that quite a bit.
Yeah.
In the past, that when they have exercises, we
Yeah.
bring the
I think
buses
that-
and let them know how to do
Yeah, but an elderly care facility with bus power, we sent a bus from, I think, Northampton to take care of people. A couple of years back.
The buses stay warm as long as it's operational, and we hold them until they tell us where to bring them.
Unless it's an electric bus.
Yeah, that's gonna be very exciting.
So just to clarify, we have, right now we have 7 electric buses. 3 of them are the first generation, so they're not going to. 4 of them have put gasoline. We have 8 that are coming by the end of October. And 1 will be at Mass Transit, 1 will be at the North End Garage, the other 1 will be at Springfield, and then we're placing an order for an additional 8 for 7, depending on the price.
Okay. Yeah, for great presentation, and I think very valid, and also really serving because of equity a lot. And you also cannot compare like public transportation in this area, with the urban area, Springfield, not compared to like we talk about Boston or something. I think the riders are different here, or in Springfield than in Boston. But I think it's great to look at this. Impressive presentation. Another thing I think it's maybe important to look at in terms of accessibility is the schedule. When we worked in Springfield a lot in downtown, oh yeah, the students, oh, that's great, all great bus service, all connected. But then please look how is the service on the weekends and how is the service later and not later at night, but after 7. So don't compare it to the grade 43, which also reduced a little bit service, but service hours. But I think it's better to look at this too, because that's how people are actually able to get to work back. It's very much depending on schedule, and people work on Sundays too. They also work on Saturdays, so just common sense stuff. I think it's important to look at, but I don't know if there's room in your research because you already covered.
Yeah, I think Frank's, I know we talked about Frank's comment, but this idea that accessibility is not just quarter mile bus stop, but also how long your trip takes to get to and from your destination. To Frank's point about weekends, he knows that's a real tough problem. Yes, the headwinds.
Paragraph about it. I mean, we don't think cover it, but it's also, or dump it on the 222 class.
Hi.
Hi. So I'm gonna go one better and say it's probably one of the best presentations I've ever seen in terms of graphics. Irritates me, but it should be a lot. So these are just things to think about as the next phase in terms of future scenarios. I didn't hear the word intermodality. I think the articulation between micro mobility, bus mobility within the PBK system macro mobility is really key to increasing ridership, to make it competitive in terms of so Springfield got its act together and created a really robust intermodal center. Holyoke is still separated. Northampton is still separated. So that's going to be a really key issue going forward. Paratransit. So I think, just sort of addressing that as part of the mix and whether it's actual use and potential future use. Frank's point about frequency is really important. Your spatial analysis is excellent. Have a similar sort of temporal analysis. I think that's going to make it really strong. Trip chaining, so addressing that issue of people who are going from home to dropping off at daycare to work to shopping, how to make those kinds of trips more efficient. And then in terms of autonomous vehicles, I think it's not the solution at a place like Newcastle with a cow catcher in the front. But in the longer distance, lower density routes, autonomous vehicles, AI, ATS have some real possibility. And the final question I had is there going to be any intermediate work in between the two studios? Anyway, excellent work.
Well, I'll address that question and say once you have signed the contract, yes. Yes, we have the plan to have the work continue through the 2 years. There is another UMass project that is sort of taking the work that this studio and Grand Studio is doing, looking at energy efficiency modeling. So there are lots of connections over the next years. That's being done in civil engineering. But I think all of Mark's comments, especially the first, were great. But I think this question of trip chaining to really get to trip times and headways and what the reality on the ground is for people who are trying to go about their daily life using only transit. It's really important.
You said, you want to compete. We have a business. We want to compete with the car. How good are we doing? What can we do to make that? It requires a lot of investment into the system and to your questions about the ridership. We had the highest ridership for PTA 2016, 12 million passengers. So that's because a lot of money was invested. After that, we relied on the state to fund a lot of PTA. 50% of PTA's funding comes from the state, and every year it's a begging year. Ask the governor put the budget, and the House and the Senate have another budget, and try to marry it. And for the last 4 years, I didn't pay my first year, I had about $3 million worth of service. And that was Saturday and Sundays, because that's where the less people are using it. So that's the express routes, because we have some. But if we don't get the funding, there's nothing that we can do to maintain what we have if we know it's not sufficient. So we're constantly working with the legislature, and this year they were great. They went against the governor. We had additional monies, and we will be able to use those monies that we also have some here. We have to be very careful because once that goes, the state's not going to stay out of the But we have brought the state out to notice that we are having difficulties, all the RTAs, obtaining drivers, and that we have to provide different benefits to the drivers. You can't compete with other businesses that are offering higher salaries and better benefits. Right next door to Springfield Garage is Dave's Trucking. He has a sign that says I hire mechanics for $70 an hour. We don't pay that 2 hours. You think anyone's going to come over there? Of course. I walk into PBTA when we require mechanics to have a CDL in order to be able to drive the bus into the garage and all that stuff. So, there's a lot of moving parts and a lot of pieces, and this is one piece that is a very important piece. And I'm really, really grateful. And like I said, it's a very professional. I'm impressed. I'm really, really taken back by how well this was done, the presentation and everything else. So I want to, thank you on behalf of PBTA and the board, like I usually do. But I also want to say it. You were my students, you will get an A. Number 2, when I was here and we did our big project, it was to do a concrete roof. We poured concrete and it floated. We went to the lake, but by the time we came back, it sunk. And the last thing I want to give you, thank you so much for coming to PETA.
We would never. If there's one last question, Henry, I'd love to hear it. You have the power.
Do you all hear me okay? Yeah, I didn't want to follow that. I want to just say, like, I agree with Mark, this was an exceptionally good presentation. I applaud the speaker for me. Yeah. I think you all did a great job. I think that one of the things that really stood out in the presentation of this studio was how well you did at conceptualizing the issues that you were dealing with and explaining the project before diving into the data. I really felt like you were presenting what I would call a conceptual model of what it is you're doing before getting to the the things like the regional discussion of the regional context. There's such a clear articulation of the problems and the constraints. I thought that really set the stage for the rest of the presentation in a way that there were a few things. I think a lot of the specific things that I said were mentioned by others. Like, for instance, one of the things that struck me watching it that was a little bit understated, but it probably is a part of your analysis, is really the focus on the destinations, which I think Robert mentioned something about, like, what are the good things like that. So that's obviously something, you don't just focus on the origins and on the characteristics that are using the system, but also where the destinations were. And that varies a lot between the upper portion of the Pioneer Valley and the destinations. Are probably going to be a lot more. The issue of remote work, future of work, kind of came up, especially in relationship to drivers, and just like something that we may have a future conversation about. I wrote a grant application with my colleague Shannon Roberts in engineering last year, looking very deeply at this issue of the driver shortage in CDL. CDL driver shortages mainly focused on commercial, right, and on goods movement as opposed to people movement, and how that related to certifications and training and autonomous vehicles. And while we didn't get that grant funded by the NSF, we did kind of do a deep dive on those questions. If you ever want to have me kind of come in and tell you what I know, I don't think that that's something you can solve in this studio, right? But it is, if you want to kind of back up information on some of those issues, I'd be more than happy to talk about. Well, it's fascinating. I mean, it really is. Just how intertwined the different industries are in the employment demand, in the commercial sector and how it relates to the public sector. You can't think of these things in isolation, right? Because this is a widespread labor shortage in driving, in commercial driving, and the solutions for it, you're also kind of need to take that into consideration. The last thing that I wanted to say, also, I think that it's beyond the focus of this particular studio, but it was something that really got my creative energies going and watching this, is just how limited it is to I love the maps, but route maps as thematic maps for a public presentation really don't get very much across. And I don't think that you all can fix that per se, but it just kind of made me wonder to myself, what are better visualizations that we can use for some of this information than the traditional GIS-based map? And I say that as a person who teaches GIS.
I will say, Henry, I will put in a plug. The website has more abstract visualizations of some of the concepts, including, thank you, Anna Maria, some lovely animations that have been done. And so I totally agree with you, and they are working through a lot of that with the website.
I think some of the network statistics might work well, like the dendrographs and things like that, but I don't know. That might be, again, you have so much work to do. I don't want to throw more on your plate, but I was just saying as I was watching it, I was thinking, how can we take the same information
and display it in a different way where the main points come out more, because especially with route maps on United Maps, the information is hard to differentiate.
But, you know, but, I didn't see that as a liability in this presentation at all. But
Well, I think, I guess, Henry, you got the last word. I know that's rare. So I will just add my thanks to everyone for coming. I love these students. They've done such an incredible job. So I'm not only pleased that you all got to show up all your work, but that you get to do it again. So come back and stay tuned, and please visit their website. Like I said, it's incredible. They've done a GIS scoring map. They have animation. So you don't just have to rewatch the recording of today. All the information is up there. It's mobile friendly, so you can look at it on your phone when you're riding the bus. And there's a comment box if you didn't get to share with us any of your questions or comments. Please feel free to use that, or you can email me or any of the students directly. But thank you all for coming.
I didn't get any good questions. You guys were sending them to my Twitter. So I was wondering if you could just, like the leading student. Oh, yeah.